During the court proceedings, I deal now with the demeanor of the accused in court. During the court proceedings, the accused became emotional from time to time. For example, when clips of the emergency meeting were played in court and during the testimony of the pathologist, it is to be expected that it would be emotional to relive the traumatic events, and his reaction was not unusual in the circumstances. During his testimony, the accused appeared to be uncomfortable at times, and at other times he appeared to be superbly confident. On a question whether he was the only person alive that could remember what transpired the night of the murders, the accused almost sarcastically responded that he had no idea what the attacker's memory is like. He would make statements like, "We made every effort to minimize my exposure to those photos," with reference to photo album Exhibit 8. At one point he wanted to clarify what his counsel was objecting to. What struck the court was that the accused did not show a great deal of emotion, even when he demonstrated the blows when the attacker hit Rudy and his father, as well as the altercation between himself and the attacker. At times he would give a lot of factual detail just to be vague. When he was confronted with difficult issues, for example the dog's illness and why it was not barking, in what position his father was when he was attacked by the murderer, as well as why he did not warn and help his mother and sister. The weapons used during the commission of the crimes. Defense counsel admitted that the axe handed in Exhibit 1 is the same axe that appears in photo album Exhibit A, and agreed that the axe appeared to be new. It is clear that the axe in the photographs had been used to attack the victims. Apart from the visuals contained in the photo album, Lieutenant Colonel Charlotte Otto, attached to the South African Police Services as the Chief Forensic Analyst and reporting officer at the biology section of the Forensic Science Laboratory, is referred to as FSL, testified that the DNA profile of the majority of victims could be read into the swab blood samples taken from the axe. The state submitted that the axe belonged to the Van Breda family. James Reed John, Marley's friend, did not recognize the axe as the one belonging to the Van Breda family. However, he recognized the size and shape of the axe as similar to the one he had seen in the garage and at the fireplace. He never saw the Van Breda family using the axe. From his recollection, the head or top of the axe was black, but said that he could be wrong about the color. Exhibit 1 is in fact a dark green headed axe with black at the top. Captain Joubert testified that the axe had a dark blade appearance. The description given by Mr. Reed John was similar to Exhibit 1, except of course for his indication of the color. Ms. Princess Minkokani, the housekeeper or domestic worker, testified that the axe she identified was the same type of axe and similar in size and appearance as the one she had seen at the house. She says the axe was normally stored in the scullery on the shelf behind the ironing board, as can be seen in Exhibit AZ2. It had been kept there ever since she started working for the Van Breda family in October 2014. The ironing board was usually stored in the same position unless she was using it. She said that she had seen a lot of axes in her lifetime and described the axe as a small size axe. The axe was hardly used and was always in a pantry. Sergeant Apollos testified that only one axe had been found on the crime scene by the police. There was no indication of a second axe, and no axe was found in the pantry or at the house after the incident. Although Precious Mkunkani and James Lee John were aware of the presence of the axe in the house, the accused distanced himself from the axe in his statement to the police. According to the accused, he did not know the family had an axe in the house, despite living with the family since April 2014. It is noteworthy that Mr. Reed John and Mali were in a relationship from February 2014 onwards, and he as a visitor was aware of the axe. According to Mr. Reed John, Martin bought the axe in 2014, and it does seem to fit. It does seem that the axe was hardly used with the family. Importantly, the accused conceded that Exhibit 1 and 2, that's the axe and the knife, originated from the house. This was during his cross-examination by Ms. Calloway. It is the state's case that the injuries sustained by the deceased and Mali were caused by the axe found on the scene. Defence counsel suggested during the testimony of Captain Brown that a second axe was possibly used during the commission of the crimes. It was the contention of the defence that the chance of Exhibit 1 being the weapon with which Mali was attacked was virtually nil. Mali had 8 penetrating wounds without leaving any trace on Exhibit 1. It is assumed that Defence Counsel was referring to blood or swab DNA. Defence Counsel argued that the DNA evidence refutes the state's narrative completely. In court, the accused maintained that there was more than one attacker in the house the morning in question. It was argued that the only reasonable possibility is that Mali was not attacked by the same assailant who attacked the other family members, and she was also not attacked with Exhibit 1, that's the axe we're talking about. This submission was made on the premise that the DNA evidence is accepted by the court. Captain Marius Joubert, the bloodstain pattern analyst and forensics crime scene expert, testified that Mali was repeatedly hit with an object similar to the axe. Of importance is that according to Dr. Daphne Anthony, the state pathologist, the type of injuries to Mali's head were similar to the type of injuries sustained by the other 3 deceased members of the family. They sustained chop and incised wounds, and the measurements of Mali's wounds were more or less the same as in the case of the other victims. Professor Jacob Dempers, a registered medical practitioner and pathologist, testified with reference to the wounds of Mali and the deceased that all the defects appeared to be large in length and penetrated quite deeply into the tissue. It is highly unlikely that the alleged perpetrators would fortuitously bring along a similar axe than the one kept in the Van Breda house, inflicting similar type of injuries, and that a second attacker would inflict injuries with more or less the same degree of force. I repeat that, that's a finding of this court. It is highly unlikely that the alleged perpetrators would fortuitously bring along a similar axe than the one kept in the Van Breda home, inflicting similar type injuries, and then inflicting similar injuries, and that the second attacker would inflict injuries with more or less the same degree of force. The defense DNA expert, Dr. Antonelle Ockers, testified that she could not explain the presence of Mali's touch DNA found on the axe DNA could remain for quite a while on the surface, depending on the type of surface. However, Dr. Alkes was unable to confirm how long touch DNA could remain on an item. Teresa's DNA was found on the head of the axe in the mixture results. In these results, the inference can be drawn that she had been attacked with the same axe as Rudy and Martin. A mixture of Rudy and Teresa's DNA or possible blood was found on the axe blade and head of the axe. Her touch DNA was also found on the axe. She also probably might have touched the axe while defending herself. Marley sustained the injuries during the confrontation with the attacker was likely in the same area as Teresa. It is highly unlikely that they were attacked by two different attackers in a relatively confined space with similar weapons more or less at the same time. The accused confirmed during cross-examination that Marley was eventually found in about the same position from where he initially glimpsed her in pursuit of the attacker. Although Marley could move her limbs, no evidence was presented that she could make significant movements to move from one spot to the other. The axe did not have much blood on it, as would be expected if it was used in so many murders. But I might read that again. The axe did not have as much blood on it as one would expect if it was used in so many murders. All the victims were struck multiple times. When one used the axe repeatedly and the axe impacted with the next victim, blood would be, quote, ejected from the axe. Captain Joubert collected 8 swabs from the axe, 4 swabs from the handle of the axe, and 4 from the blade of the axe. The swabs 6A to 6H represented the entire axe. Captain Joubert took the swabs in addition to the 4 swabs taken by Warrant Officer Hitchcock. 3 of the swabs taken by Warrant Officer Hitchcock were tested for the presence of blood, and 1 test for the touch DNA. Despite the fact that the swabs were representative of the entire axe, only certain random blood spots on the axe were identified and analyzed. Captain Joubert testified that it was possible that the spot on the axe had been missed when the 8 samples were collected. Furthermore, Lieutenant Colonel Otto testified that in respect to the blood swabs from the bottom of the axe handle, bottle swab, not swabs, from the bottom of the axe handle, she could only include the reference sample of the accused in the mixture, although there was more DNA. The other DNA belongs to family members, but she could not say to which family members. Therefore, additional DNA was found, but it was not enough to reach a result. The possibility that Marley's blood was also on the axe, but that it was not enough to obtain a DNA profile, cannot be entirely ruled out. A second axe and the absence of Marley's blood on the accused's shorts and socks. Defense counsel argued that if Marley was attacked with another similar object, it would explain the absence of Marley's DNA on the accused's sleeping shorts and socks. Captain Joubert pointed out that none of the stains on the shorts, socks and the 2 duvets were presumptively tested for blood with reference to his assumptions contained in paragraph 8 of his statement. Defense counsel acknowledged that the chances that the stains were anything other than blood where the DNA result was obtained was so slim that it could be ignored. Captain Joubert testified, and I quote, "The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. One could actually strike a person with an axe without getting a single drop of blood on you." The witness said that the position of the attacker would play a role on Marley. It would play a role. Marley had 5 very deep lacerations in the skull and on the arm, ear and neck respectively. All the wounds were on one side, namely the left side of the body, and one wound on the right side. Captain Jubei said the absence of Marley's blood could possibly be explained because the injuries were not close to each other. In the case of impact to the blood source, most spatter could be directed away from the attacker. Very little would come back to the attacker. That might explain the absence of Marley's blood on the shorts and socks of the captain. In conclusion, Captain Jubei confirmed the following possibilities as reasons for the absence of Marley's blood on the shorts of the accused. 1. The accused was not the attacker. 2. The directionality of the blood spatter was away from the attacker. And 3. Some of the 19 blood stains where no DNA profile was found could have emanated from Marley or could be Marley's blood. If there was a second axe used to attack Marley and carried by the attacker from the first landing to the back door, around the house to exit via the side door on the other side of the house, the absence of a corresponding drip trail or blood spatter appears to be unlikely. No DNA was found pertaining to the possible blood drop on the kitchen door, and according to Lieutenant Colonel Otto, it could possibly have been animal blood. Only human DNA can be extracted from the blood. Marley was also not the donor of the 2 solitary drops below the boy's window on the wall of the adjacent property. During cross-examination by the state, the accused conceded that the attacker used the same type of weapon and executed the same type of attack on the victims. It is highly unlikely that a second person would have executed blows in predominantly the same area as the other attacker, that is, the head of the victims, and with more or less the same degree of violence or force. It is also unlikely that Teresa and Marley would have been attacked by the 2 attackers almost simultaneously in the same area. The accused said it was plausible that there was a second axe on the scene. However, the accused conceded that his family members were all attacked by the same attacker wielding the same weapon. He said he only saw one attacker and one axe. When asked whether he accepted that no other axe was found and it's unlikely that there was a second axe on the scene, the accused agreed. He agreed that no evidence of a second axe exists. During the emergency call, the accused told Ms. Philander that someone attacked his family, 3 adults and 1 teenager, with an axe. No allegations of a second attacker with a second axe was made by the accused shortly after the incident. My conclusion with regard to the second axe, apart from the fact that it can be clearly seen on the photographs in the photo album, that Exhibit 1A had been used to commit the crimes, Exhibit 1 had been used to commit the crimes. The accused himself only mentioned one axe used by an alleged intruder. Captain Brown testified that she cleaned the axe herself during the investigation. The court finds that there is no convincing basis or any witness basis at all for the contention that a second axe had been used during the attack. The court is satisfied that Exhibit 1 is the only axe used during the commission of the crimes and that it belonged to the Van Breda household, being fairly new as well as similar in size, shape and appearance as the axe kept in the house, as well as the fact that no other axe was found in the house or in the pantry. No evidence of the presence of a second act exists on the accused's own version. The knife. And I'll deal with the knife, Exhibit 2. The knife handed in Exhibit 2 was found in the scene partly hidden under Rudy's bed. The accused alleged that an intruder stabbed him with a knife. The accused testified that the attacker recovered fairly quickly after being disarmed and came back at him with a knife in his right hand. The attacker did not see where the knife came from. The accused did not see where the knife came from. The accused said that he pulled the knife out of his side and dropped it, presumably somewhere on the floor in the first bedroom. On 24th August 2015, Captain Stein and Warrant Officer Hitchcock compared Exhibit 2 with the knives inside the house. The contents of the drawer in the kitchen where the knives were kept and a set of Victorinox knives can be seen in Exhibit E3. According to Captain Stein, 2 knives and a fork inside the drawer in the kitchen look the same as Exhibit 2. The accused testified that Exhibit 2 resembles the kitchen knives and agreed that the knife came from the kitchen. The accused confirmed that the knives were kept in the top drawer. The extended view of the kitchen can be seen in Exhibit A33 to A36. The kitchen appeared to be undisturbed, except for the 2 drawers in the same location. It was the only cabinetry disturbed in the kitchen. The court is satisfied that Exhibit 2 belonged to the Van Breda household, being part of a set of Victorinox knives kept in the kitchen drawer. An axe, the motive of the alleged intruders and the weapons used. An axe would be a peculiar choice of weapon for a burglar or thief to take along to the intended crime scene. Before the attack, the Van Breda family was presumably all asleep, except for the accused who was in the ensuite bathroom of the first bedroom. The accused did not hear the intruders inside the house before the attack on his brother. There was no risk of identifying the balaclava wearing intruders, and therefore no reason for the intruder with the intention to steal to wipe out almost an entire family, oblivious to the presence of the intruders. The violence prevalent in the country does not serve as a convincing explanation, or at all, as argued by defense counsel for this scenario. If the intention of the intruders was to kill the occupants of the house, it would be senseless not to bring along a weapon. The alleged intruder clearly planned the commission of crimes by wearing gloves, dark clothes and a balaclava. Laughing while attacking the family members certainly appears to be a strange behavior for a random assailant. It cannot possibly be expected from a perpetrator with a personal bias, personal issue. The accused conceded that it would be strange that the person who planned to enter the house and attack the family came unarmed or armed inadequately that night. He found it strange that the one person who went upstairs was also incidentally the same person who was armed with both the knife and the axe that came from the kitchen of the very house. The severity of the attack, the degree of violence displayed towards the deceased victims and Mali seems to be excessive. All the deceased and Mali had several wounds directed at the part of the human body with a high mortality rate, according to both doctors, according to Dr. Anthony, the pathologist. The attack on the family, the attack on the accused was not with the same intensity than on the other family members. So it is unlikely that the attacker had a grudge against the accused. On a question why the accused did not have potentially fatal wounds, the accused conceded that the attack on him was more restrained compared to the other family members. I deal with motive to commit these crimes. Cornelius van Breda testified that his brother Martin had no enemies. He was not involved in any underhanded business transactions, and that Martin's former colleagues had the greatest respect for him. Mr. Reed John and Ms. van der Westhuizen testified that the Van Bredas were a normal family with normal differences. The accused testified that he was unaware of anyone bearing a grudge against the family members. If the alleged intruder wanted to kill Martin, it does not make sense why he attacked Rudy first. The accused agreed that initially the attacker targeted Rudy and then the rest of the family. The accused testified that he could not think of a reason why Rudy appeared to be specifically attacked and why the intruder did not simply remove valuables from the house. Rudy studied and lived in Australia before the attack and was home only for a short while on holiday. It is most unlikely that he made enemies who would go to such an extent in such a short time. Defense counsel argued that the accused had no reason to attack his family and had no motive, as the family was a close-knit family without serious issues. Furthermore, it was argued on behalf of the accused that there seemed to be no tension or unresolved issues in the Van Breda household up to 200 hours on 26 January 2015, based on communication via WhatsApp between the accused and Bianca, and the lack of communication between Marley and James after 2200 hours that particular night. The accused version is that there was no argument amongst the family members on 26 January 2015. Arguments in the family centered around Marley because she was growing up and starting to rebel. The accused denied having any serious arguments with his family and stated there was nothing out of the ordinary the evening before the attack. No evidence exists to indicate a specific motive for killing any of the apparently decent family members, whether they were killed by an unknown intruder or the accused. The neighbors of the Van Breda, Opdorf and Stalia testified that the estate was a safe and secure environment to stay in, and none of them reported any suspicious persons or incidents in the vicinity of Gosker Street the day of the murders. Ms. Tilliard heard nothing untoward that particular night, despite being a light sleeper and the fact that the murders were committed not far from her house. The only unusual event or evidence of something unusual was loud male voices coming from the Van Breda residence, heard by Ms. Opdorf between 2200 hours at midnight, between 10 and 12 that particular evening. Ms. Opdorf resided at 10 Gosker Street, across the street from the Van Breda residence. She testified that she heard loud male voices with an aggressive undertone that sounded like an argument from the direction of the Van Breda house the night of 27 January. It lasted from 2200 hours until midnight. without stating that it was unabated or uninterrupted. It barely went on continuously. She confirmed there were plants and shrubs in front of ours and that the curtains and windows were closed. Mr. Optworth testified that the house consisted of a lot of glass and French windows. During the inspection in loco, it was evident that there is a balcony door leading from the boys' room to an outside balcony with a view of Miss Optworth's house across the street. Miss Opthoff's uncontested evidence is that the audio specialist tested the reliability of her version afterwards and confirmed the possibility of her having heard sound coming from the Van Breda residence. Her sons were also woken up, and the sons are babies, at approximately 04 the next morning. Fortuitously the time that the murders probably happened. Considering that it happened at a quiet time at night, in a quiet environment, and the other factors the court and the above factors we have listed about, the court finds that Miss Opthoff must have been able to hear the sounds as she testified. According to the accused, the Van Breda men watched a movie called Star Trek II, Into Darkness. It was suggested that the movie was approximately 2 hours long, and that was what Ms. Opthoff had heard at the time. Ms. Opthoff was adamant that he did not listen to a movie with music and a soundtrack, and testified that she was familiar with the Star Trek theme song. The loud voices were so disturbing that she had a fright. Ms. Opthoff is an independent witness but is unwilling to get involved. She did not implicate any specific person, including the accused. Ms. Opthoff was an impressive witness, and the court has no reason to disbelieve her or to reject her evidence. It is inconceivable that an unknown perpetrator would gain entry to the house with great planning and effort, seriously injure the entire family in the manner for no apparent reason, except perhaps for the accused, and flee again without taking obviously valuable items from the house. The court does not have to speculate about the motive of the assailant. With regard to the intention of the perpetrator, on 29 January 2015, Dr. Daphne Anthony, a senior specialist in forensic pathology, performed the post-mortem examinations and recorded the findings in the post-mortem reports marked Exhibits L, M, and N. She was appointed as a senior specialist forensic pathologist at the Stellenbosch mortuary from May 2009 until June 2016. Dr. Anthony said that the use of the axe would fit in, as Exhibit 1, would fit in with the injuries. She described the axe as a heavy object with a sharp edge and said that it was consistent with the chop wounds inflicted with a tremendous amount of force and high rate of speed. According to Dr. Small-Smith, the injuries presented by Mali are not only potentially fatal, they are in fact usually fatal. He confirmed that Mali's prognosis upon admission was poor. The injuries fit in with the infliction with a sharp instrument like an axe. I may at this stage record that Mali was not called as a witness because he apparently has retrograde amnesia. She was anyway, and she's not participated in this case. The deceased injuries were confined to the head. Rudy suffered the most violent attack of the deceased in terms of the number of injuries. Second was Martin, and then Teresa with lesser injuries. Dr. Anthony testified that Marley's injuries to her head and neck were consistent with injuries sustained by the other 3 deceased family members. Injuries to her hands and extremities were indicative of self-defense of injured wounds and were multiple in origin, indicative of a severe scuffling, also perhaps indicative of a desperate attempt to protect herself. Considering the seriousness and number of head injuries, the location of the wounds, considerable amount of force which was inflicted, there can be no doubt that the attacker had the intention to kill the deceased and to kill Marley. Dr. Anthony testified that the traumatic head injury has a high mortality rate. The accused conceded during cross-examination that the intent was to kill if one hit the person over the head with an axe. Defense counsel correctly conceded that Marley's injuries were life-threatening and were inflicted with the intention to kill her. Whether an intruder entered the house armed with an axe or the perpetrator armed himself with an axe from the pantry inside the house, the attack on the presumably sleeping family members on the first floor of the house and in the early hours of the morning had to be planned. The weapon had to be taken to the first floor. It would not have been readily at hand at the time of the attack. Marley's injuries were indicative of a severe scuffling. This was in comparison to Rudy's pinky wound and Theresa's thumb. With Marley, more severe injuries, and specifically the location of the injuries, more on the extremities and hands, were indicative of a significant struggle going on during the attack in a desperate attempt to save her life. Dr. Anthony said she could postulate the possible sequence of events inferring from her observation. She inter alia postulated that Rudy's injuries showed him lying on the bed on the right side of the face due to the fact that his injuries were located to the lateral aspect, neck and the left, as well as the straight side of his neck. By the infliction of the trauma, he was aware of the blows and what was coming. He raised his hands in an attempt to ward off the attack. That's why he sustained an incised wound on his little finger with lifting of the nail. First, the 2 incised wounds described in paragraph 4.1 and 4.2 of Exhibit L were inflicted, and then the other wounds followed. The injuries of the accused. On 27 January 2015 at about 10:30, Dr. Albertser examined the accused as a victim. Dr. Albertser recorded the injuries sustained by the accused on a J88 form, which was handed up as an exhibit LL. The recorded injuries were read out by Dr. Alberts. The accused had 4 parallel, quote, very superficial, unquote, cuts on his left forearm, 2 above his right nipple, and another above that. A superficial stab wound on the left thorax, 1 superficial cut above his left nipple, and 2 stab wounds to the left abdominal area. Most of the injuries on the front of his body and forearm broke the skin. On his back, he had a scratch on the left side of his back over the scapula and a scratch on the right side of his back under the scapula. These scratches did not break the skin. He had 2 abrasions on his back. There was old scarring on his right knee, a bruise and swelling just below it, and another 2 old bruises. He had a swelling above his left eye and a bruise under it. Dr. Albertser testified that she did not regard the injuries as serious. The possibility of self-inflicted wounds arises. The accused alleged that one of the policemen that accompanied him to Dr. Albertser asked her whether the wounds were self-inflicted, and that Dr. Albertser replied that she could see what she could do. Dr. Albertser could not remember whether the question was asked at the time. At a later stage, Colonel Bieneke asked her opinion about the cut wounds on the thorax and left forearm of the accused and the method of inflicting the wounds. Dr. Albertser did not give an opinion, but instead had asked Dr. Timmensma to furnish an opinion. It is put to Dr. Albertser that the accused will say that the assailant had a knife in his hand and cut and stabbed while the accused held on to the arm of the assailant. A demonstration by Advocate Bertha is described as follows. The accused held onto his arm of the assailant, with his right hand close to the elbow of the assailant, who cut the accused over his thorax and arm. Dr. Albertser replied that it was possible but unlikely. However, she indicated that she was hesitant to say it was unlikely. It is noted that during his testimony, the accused testified that he grabbed the attacker's right hand, holding the knife just below the wrist, and not close to his elbow, as stated by Advocate Bertha. In his plea explanation, it was alleged that the accused was holding on to the right forearm of the attacker, not just below the attacker's wrist, as he testified later. Dr. Marianne Timmensma, the forensic pathologist who I have referred to earlier, her expertise included pathology, which she started to practice in 2007. Apart from forensic pathology, she also practiced clinical science. Her qualifications and experience are listed in some detail in Exhibit NN. Dr. Timmensma was asked by the South African Police Services, SABC, and Dr. Albertser to comment on the method used and the manner in which the accused sustained the injuries. The witness received a written request from Dr. Albertser, the J88, a typed copy of the translation of Dr. Albert's findings in English, and the photographs contained in Exhibit C. The police also brought the suspected weapon, Exhibit 2, in an evidence bag to her office. At a later stage, she also had the plea explanation of the accused at her disposal. Colonel Bieneke requested telephonically whether the accused could comment on the wounds of the accused and the issue of possible self-inflicted injuries. She said it was not unusual to receive such a request. Dr. Timmensma compiled 2 reports on the findings with regard to the injuries sustained by the accused and handed in as Exhibit NN2 and 3 respectively. Defence counsel submitted that the mandate with which Dr. Timmensma was tasked was embedded with an inherent confirmation bias. There are in fact no grounds for this submission, as Dr. Timmensma not only motivated the conclusion thoroughly, she also referred to textbook pictures for confirmation of her conclusion. The absence of bias is inter alia illustrated by a concession that it's a difficult task to determine whether injuries have been self-inflicted or not. She also identified certain injuries to be self-inflicted and others not necessarily so. It was further argued that the analysis cannot be afforded the same weight as stemming from a physical, contemporaneous examination of the patient and his injuries. The same argument goes for the defense experts on the injuries of the accused. Dr. Timmensma had the opportunity to form an opinion from the enlarged photographs and the detailed notes of Dr. Albertson. No tests were required to come to a conclusion. Dr. Timmensma summarized the accused's injuries as thorax, head, back and leg injuries. Dr. Timmensma confirmed that the injuries on the dorsal aspect of the left arm, marked A to D, and to the chest arm, marked E to F and H, were consistent with self-inflicted injuries. The other injuries were less likely to be self-inflicted and were unusual if self-inflicted. During cross-examination, Dr. Timmensma conceded it was very difficult to determine whether wounds were self-inflicted. But in this instance, she was adamant that was indeed the case. The fact that the wounds were superficial and non-fatal was not necessarily conclusive. One had to look at all the characteristics of the wounds. The more characteristics that were present, the more suspicious you would get. One would then look at how they would have been sustained, that is the history and the discrepancies. Conclusions of possible self-inflicted injuries are determined by a number of factors, and one had to look at it in its totality. The cut marks on the chest were superficial and non-fatal. Incisions at an equal depth were parallel and avoided sensitive areas like the nipples. The chest injuries were reachable area for self-infliction. The forearms were also in keeping with self-inflicted injuries, non-lethal, superficial, of an equal depth, and the cuts were parallel. It was unlikely for victims being attacked to stand still and not take evasive action to allow such multiple and uniform injuries to be executed. The incisions on the left forearm and the accused, the incisions were on the left forearm, and the accused was reportedly right-handed. It was not a typical area where one would expect defense or defensive wounds with sharp instrument attacks. Defense wounds were more likely to be found on the ventral palmar aspect of the forearm or wrist, or the backs of the hands or fingers from non-grasping movements in attempts to ward off a weapon. The forearm injuries were in reachable areas for being self-inflicted. Therefore, the injuries to the former arm, as well as the cuts to the chest, were consistent with being self-inflicted. The other injuries of the accused were less likely to be self-inflicted. Dr. Timmensma referred to a report dated 12 April with regard to the reasons for describing some of the accused's injuries as possibly self-inflicted injuries. If one looked at the type of wounds to his chest, abdomen and arm, they were superficial and non-fatal. The cuts occasionally penetrated the skin, and the incisions were regular and were linear and were parallel. The wounds were grouped and similar in appearance. It appeared to be a typical self-inflicted injury wounds. The wounds were regular and equal in depth and origination, uniform, linear, no movement in the wounds, and parallel. Equal depth could be inflicted by another person, but the track and direction of the wound would differ because a person would want to withdraw or evade the infliction of the wounds. There would be a deeper entrance, and it would become more shallow if someone was stabbed by another person. The cuts were not only parallel, but also avoided sensitive areas. It was unlikely that someone would have stood still and not taken evasive action. Self-inflicted wounds would usually be found on the chest, abdomen, arms, or hands of a person. And as I said before, the wounds were in reachable areas and were accessible. The witness added 3 more reasons to a report. on which her report was based, on which her opinion was based. That is, the wounds were symmetrical, of uniform shape, and that the same instrument had been used. Dr. Timmensma explained that symmetrical wounds were both sides of the body and have exactly the same appearance. The cuts could have been caused by one instrument. Conclusions of possible self-inflicted wounds are determined by a number of factors, and as you said before, it had to be looked at in its totality. State Counsel, Ms. Galloway, described the circumstances to the witness, saying that the alleged attack took place in the bedroom at the foot of the beds, with two persons facing each other with sharp weapons and pushing and pulling each other. Dr. Timmensma responded that in the circumstances, holding on to each other, it would be very difficult to execute very uniform and similar incisions to another person's body. The angles and directions of the incisions would be different if a person pulled away. The wounds on the torso and left arm of the accused were very similar. Dr. Timmensma stated that in respect of the injuries to the arm, the accused had a group of wounds parallel to each other and with equal depth. Dr. Timmensma testified that the cuts were also very uniform and linear. There was lots of movement, so it would be unlikely to inflict wounds of the same nature. One would expect different angles and depth. It was the same attacker who inflicted serious harm to other people. She testified that it was very unlikely that the wounds were inflicted as demonstrated by defense counsel. Defense counsel put it to the witness that a person's wrist could move, then only part of the skin would be slashed. The witness said that with the movement, pushing and pulling, one could not slash with resistance applied to the hand. One may be able to stab but not slash. The wounds were suspicious even before the witness had the benefit of the plea explanation and when she compiled Exhibit NN2. The witness said that the accused indicated the degree of movement in paragraph 31 by saying that they pushed and pulled each other, stepping forward and backwards. She agreed that the adrenaline level of the accused would have been raised quite high and the person might not feel the pain with superficial cuts. She asked, why would anybody stand still when the cutting happened? One would not be defending yourself by standing still. If the accused stood still, it would be possible to have made those cuts. But the accused never described or did not say that he was standing still during the struggle. Dr. Timmensma said she looked at the totality of the appearance of the wounds. She testified that the wounds must not be evaluated in isolations. The wounds were on the left forearm of the accused. He was right-handed, as I've said before. The cuts were also superficial and non-fatal. There was dried blood in all the wounds, but the blood spots were not relevant. Dr. Timmensma testified that the wounds were parallel and grouped. Cuts B and C would meet up if they had continued. She conceded that. Dr. Timmensma testified that movement or fighting with resistance would not have resulted in those wounds. Self-mutilation did occur. She explained that in the case of self-inflicted cuts, a person would be in control of the amount of pain, the depth and the location. Cutting and slashing and another person inflicting the wounds meant one would not have control of the movement. She said that the cuts were not in keeping with flicking movements of a knife. The wounds would be deeper on one side and would go shallower. One inflicted the wound oneself. One would control the movement. Dr. Timmensma testified that there was a very strong contrast in comparison to the injuries and fatal head injuries of the rest of the family. All the described injuries of the accused were superficial, minor and non-fatal. With the most severe injury being this visual stab wound in the abdomen, wound G, with a reported depth of 10 millimeters. None showed any characteristics that was inflicted with the same intent or force as the deceased wounds. The rest of the family had extensive wounds caused by an axe with underlying skull fractures. The accused had no defensive wounds. One would have expected if another party was present. If one would try and disarm an attacker and grab with a knife or axe, one would expect there to be defensive wounds. Professor Jacob Dempers, the professor of forensic pathology, we've already referred to, was the head of the clinical unit of forensic medicine at the University of Stellenbosch. He testified that it was not a common occurrence for, when a group of people attack, the wounds to differ significantly from one person to the others. If an axe or knife was utilized as the object to create force, usually the situation where malice was intended towards people, that is not accidental injury, the wounds generally show some similarity. They see this in forensic pathology in cases where more than one member of family has been murdered. In this instance, all the defects pertaining to the Van Breda family members appeared to be similar. Similar wounds were not present on the body of the accused. Professor Dempers found it hard to believe that the assailant would only scratch the accused. A right-handed person possibly inflicted the wounds because of the fact that the wounds were predominantly on the left side of the accused's body. Professor Dempers testified that the same assailant slashed people with an axe and showed significant violence towards the deceased. There was no reason why he would be fighting differently with the accused. In his report dated 27 August 2015, Professor Dempers stated that the scratch wounds on the accused's arm were all equal in depth and were almost perfectly parallel. Two superficial stab wounds were present on the chest and abdomen, which might represent tentative or test stab swabs. The distribution pattern was equal in terms of the wounds on the chest. The witness indicated that it was hard to believe that the assailant had succeeded in causing linear scratches, some only a few millimeters apart, without the accused flinching and causing further wounds to change direction in the same region, or at least resulting in a variation in the depth of the wounds. Professor Dempers said self-inflicted injuries in textbooks made with a free hand and a controlled movement had exactly the same appearance. In the case of a struggle or any significant movement, it would not look like that, or would not virtually have the same length, etc. The cuts were made with the tip of the knife, which the accused referred to as scratches, causing blood spots. Furthermore, the witness said it could be possible that the accused sustained the cuts in the struggle, but it's highly unlikely. If part of a struggle, chances of the cuts having virtually the same length and being parallel were not likely. Professor Dempers concluded that it was not plausible and highly unlikely. In conclusion of this aspect, the court finds that there is a striking similarity between the appearance of the wounds of the accused on his forearm and thorax and textbook photographs of self-inflicted injuries. Dr. Dempers corroborated the testimony of Dr. Timmensma. The general criticism against their testimonies is directed at the premise that they are biased witnesses. The court finds that both Dr. Timmensma and Dr. Dempers were both highly professional, outstanding and reliable witnesses. Despite the fact that Dr. R. Perumal, a pathologist, was advising defense counsel in this matter and was present in court, no expert witness was called by defense on this vital issue. During argument, it was submitted by defense counsel that Dr. Perumal was not qualified to comment on self-inflicted injuries, and therefore he was not called. Advocate Bertha also suggested that Dr. Perumal was not mandated to deal with the matter. No evidence was accordingly tendered to gainsay the state's compelling evidence in this regard. If the court accepts that some of the injuries of the accused were self-inflicted, the credibility of the accused is significantly and seriously affected. During his testimony, the accused explained that the attacker was holding the knife in his fist with the blade downwards and the sharp edge facing away from the attacker. The attacker allegedly inflicted the injuries by flicking his wrist despite the blade pointing away from the attacker. State counsel confronted the accused with the appearance of his wounds and said that it matched the textbook version of self-inflicted wounds. Were similar in nature and of similar depth, all horizontal and more or less parallel to each other. The accused conceded that his wounds did conform to those descriptions, but denied that he inflicted harm upon himself. The accused said that the match between his wounds and self-inflicted injuries was purely fortuitous. I deal now with the collection of I read now the collection of forensic samples and exhibits. Warrant Officer Hitchcock from the Criminal Record Centre in Worcester, with 22 years service at the time of his testimony, testified that covered thousands of crime scenes. He was a trained evidence collector, seeding of exhibits and dispatching thereof. He arrived at this crime scene at 10:22 on 27 January. Other policemen were already there. No persons not being part of the investigation were present. Several problems inter alia, the marking and sealing of exhibits were pointed out by defense counsel. Some samples were numbered incorrectly in comparison with the photographs in Exhibit A. For example, a blue T-shirt with possible blood on it collected at the crime scene, as can be seen in Exhibit A552 and A553. It was a typing error on the side of the witness, and so on. The court is satisfied that the numbering of exhibits was explained and rectified by Warrant Officer Hitchcock during his testimony. Except for Exhibit 117, all samples were properly of DNA evidence depends crucially on other circumstantial evidence. It does not stand in isolation. In the present matter, a few inconsistencies with the numbering of the exhibits and the sealing of one of the exhibit boxes were pointed out, but the chain of custody was not otherwise disputed. The scientific validity of the DNA results were strenuously disputed by defense counsel, It was a defense case that the results had to be ignored, save for results in respect of 23 samples. In summary, defense counsel contended that the DNA evidence is inadmissible for a diverse variety of reasons. Lieutenant Colonel Charlene Otto is attached to the South African Police Services as the Chief Forensic Analyst and Reporting Officer at the Biology section of the Forensic Science Laboratory. She stated the qualifications as contained in paragraph 2 of Exhibit ZZ1. She has been attached to the Biology unit of the FSL since November 1993. Since then, she has received intensive training in inter alia DNA techniques and attended various national and international workshops, seminars and conferences pertaining to statistics, short tandem repeat STR and forensic related practices. She successfully completed both internal and external proficiency tests on a regular basis. In total, she has 31 years experience in the biological sciences. She prepared 4 reports on the Van Breda murders. These have been added in as exhibits ZZ1 to 4. I follow in the following pages, I deal with the basis on which the DNA results were channeled. The court will now adjourn to 2:15.
This sounds like a fucking